All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're about to start. I want to thank everybody in the room as well as those in the streaming. This session now is the Couchbase Lite 2.0, the easiest NoSQL embedded database to learn, adopt, and maintain. Today we have Sachin Smotra, who's our product director here for mobile, as well as Priya Rajagopal, who will help us learn more about what's going on in our mobile application and how we can help you guys get things done. So I'll turn it right over to you guys. Again, we'll try and have some Q&A with about 10 minutes left. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much, Art. And good morning, everybody. It's still morning. I think 15 minutes left. Every time I do a session, every Connect, I tell myself, I'm never going to be between people in the audience and lunch. And every time I get the slot before lunch. So I got to go talk to the folks who are organizing this, that they got to stop singling me out. But we're going to be talking about Couchbase Lite 2.0. Was released in April, middle of April. I think if I remember the date right, was 12th of April. It's been around 2 years in the making. We started the Couchbase Lite 2.0 implementation maybe a year and a half to 2 years ago. And we were in conversations then. We've completely changed the engagement model and how we built it. We've been very cognizant about getting input and feedback from our community. Over the course of those 2 years, out of which the first 6 months was spanning, so a year and a half of development, we released 23 developer builds, which was code off of our developers that was being published on our community. And we've engaged, we've gotten a whole lot of feedback around what we wanted to build in there, especially given that we were changing the API. There was a lot of value and a lot of benefit that we derived from engaging with you and folks like yourselves who are part of our online community. So we continue to encourage you to engage with us over there. And what I'm going to do over the next 10 minutes or so is give you like an overview of mobile and then talk about what's there in 2.0. And then I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Priya out here to take you through the details. So all the easy questions come here, all the difficult ones right there. So before we get started, a show of hands, how many of us are aware or have used Couchbase Mobile? All right, that's a lot of folks in the room. There are some folks who've not heard of it. Okay, so all right, so agenda, I'm going to start with an overview. We're going to go into details of what's there in Couchbase Lite 2.0. So this session is specifically focusing a deep dive into Lite 2.0, and then we want to definitely talk about deployment considerations, especially given that you'd have a mix of clients over there, so that has a lot of questions in folks' mind. What's the compatibility? And then we give you a preview of what's coming in our release right after this, which is the 2.1 release. And hopefully we'll have time for easy questions again coming to me, and you know the drill. All right, so Couchbase Mobile, for those of us who've been a part of this journey with us, you would have seen some portions of or some variation of this slide, but the slide has been pretty constant. I think in terms of vision, what we laid out maybe a year and a half or 3 years ago when we started mobile, the vision's been great and visions remain constant. I'm going to start at the left-hand side of that screen. So the big challenge with applications is that if your data is not resident on your device, then you see that spinning wheel all the time where you're trying to get data. In many cases, I think this was said in the keynote earlier today by CTO Ravi as well, it's not that the network is slow, it's just that you have to go through so many hops to get to the data that is impossible not to have that spinning wheel out there. We recognized that problem almost 4 years ago, which is when we started working on Couchbase Mobile. And the first thing we did was made sure that there was data that was available on your device so your application could get to it in millisecond time frame. There was a guaranteed millisecond response time for data that was relevant to you, which is where our Couchbase Lite database comes in, which is a full-featured embedded NoSQL database. And 2.0 is the second generation of that database. And we've got a lot of interesting capabilities that have been added in there. Once you have your data on the device, yeah, it's great, you're interacting with that data, but then that data needs to be stored back into the cloud. And even more importantly, when the data is on the device, I want to make sure that Sachin is only seeing data that is relevant to him. And if there's others, it's data that is relevant to them. So how do you do all of that? We have a gateway layer that sits in the middle tier. That basically is a transparent proxy. So you have data that is sitting on Lite, and then it's going to apply the security capabilities, the filtering, and whatever have you, provide you APIs for accessing that data from the mobile apps, or if you wanted to build a web app as well, and is sitting in the middle tier. That's where you have all of your authentication technologies built in as well. So if you have a corporate authentication server that you'd like to bring in or integrate with Couchbase Mobile, that's where that component would fit in. And last but not least, on the right-hand side of that screen, we have Couchbase Server, which is our flagship database server on the. That's going to be your centralized cloud store. It's blazing fast. I'm not even going to go into like what you can do with Couchbase Server, because that warrants like I think many sessions or maybe a full day on its own. Again, that's the Couchbase Mobile stack, and I think one thing that I always like to emphasize is when you're building applications which are going to be on your device, which is sitting on the edge, security is top of mind for everybody. So we have a fantastic security story, right from securing data on rest, whether it's on the edge or on the server, to how you bring in your own authentication mechanisms and how we provide fine-grained access control for all the data that exists within your applications. So for this talk today, the focus is going to be Couchbase Lite, and specifically the new version of Couchbase Lite that just came out in April. So let's go with like a very quick overview of the architecture. So you've got your mobile app. You're embedding the Couchbase Lite framework in there, which means you have access available to your local data. But what's really sitting inside of Couchbase Lite? What is that that's happening under the hood? So there's a native API. So if you're using whatever platform, I have the list of platforms out here. We have iOS, Android, and .NET, and we also support Xamarin for cross-platform development. So you have a native API. You would essentially work with that API. Again, before we launched 2.0, we had separate code for each platform. But with 2.0, one of the big things has been simplifications, both for us as well as for our customers. So you don't have to worry about like, has this bug been fixed in the Android branch? Has this bug been fixed in the, so you don't have to worry about any of that. We have the platform bindings that are available. That's again across platforms. There's data structure again, because we are a NoSQL database, the data is all JSON, but there is a common Lite core engine that was implemented in C++ that is common across all of the binaries, which means that anytime you face a problem, most probably the problem exists in all the versions, and then every time you fix a problem, that is applicable to all of the versions of that technology. Under the hoods, there's a binary encoder. So when you're accessing data, although you're accessing JSON on the application layer, the JSON still needs to be stored. And we have a binary encoder, which is an open source component of our platform. You can read the spec if you'd like to on our GitHub repo, which gives us really, really fast access to the data that we are storing in our storage engine. So whenever you're accessing the data, whether that's key value, that's query, that's FullText Search, capabilities that are part of 2.0, you'd be able to get to that data really, really quickly. Again, the API is consistent across all the platforms. I think that's one key tenet, because if you're beginning development in, let's say, iOS, and then you'd like to move to Android, the API shape remains exactly the same. And the, okay, if my slide will progress, there we go. So what are the features that are there in Couchbase Lite? CRUD, that's existed in the past as well. You're bringing in queries, which is queries on the edge. So Keshav talked about, right before the session, my colleague talked about nickel queries, which is SQL for JSON. The big problem with running SQL and with JSON is that we have nested objects in there. Running traditional SQL in that has always been tough. That is why nickel was created, which is our version of SQL for JSON. With the 2.0 release, we're bringing that to the edge as well. So you don't have to think of any other way of interacting with that data. The way you interact with that data on the server, you have the same unified programming model available on the edge as well. Search is a capability that came out in the 5.0 release of Couchbase Server. You have the exact same capability available on the edge as well on mobile devices. I think there was a question asked earlier about in one of the workshops on the differences between search on server and mobile. The one that I know exists right now is the fact that you can't have ranking in your search results on the mobile side. So you don't have a custom function to do that. But other than that, pretty much most of those capabilities are common across both. Having the language, the stemming, the search, the fact that you have a search index, and we'll go into more details of that as we go through the API on what that looks like, but there's consistency across the platform. So with the Couchbase data platform, you get the capabilities, the same capabilities, whether that's on the edge or on the server. A couple of others there, of course, indexing is something that's anytime you've got queries running, you want to make those queries fast. That's where the indexing capability comes in. Eventing, this has been a part of Couchbase Lite since the very beginning. It's a capability where servers played catch up with us and is coming out soon. But the ability to capture events, so it's really, really important for mobile apps, like something changed in my document. I want to be notified that something changed because then I'm going to update my UI. So all of that has been an integral part, and we'll go into details of that as well. On-device replicas, this is, again, we've been listening to our customers, and a lot of times we've got people building business-critical apps using Couchbase Mobile, specifically the Lite version. When you have data on the edge, the big problem is, what if my device just kind of stopped working, or I drop my device and my screen's cracked and I can't really use that? So in those cases, you can really swap out whatever is there on your Couchbase Lite instance using an SD card and move it to a different device and get that going really, really quickly. So you don't have to do complicated logic on like, how am I going to get this on a new device? Conflict resolution, this is something that is really, really complicated. And what we've done is we've made that automatic. So I personally think it's one of the most controversial decisions that we've made for 2.1 because we had a lot more flexibility in the 1.x product. But having done an extensive survey of how our customers were using this capability, we realized that everybody was using the default resolution that was being provided by Couchbase in terms of picking up a winner for conflicting revisions. And we've essentially made that an integral part of the product. So we're saying you can do that without writing any additional code when you're using Couchbase Lite. And last but not the least, the sync protocol is different. It's optimized so that with the same networking infrastructure, number one, it's faster. Number two, you can have more data being exchanged. It's essentially optimized to make that a lot more efficient to do synchronization. Installation options. I think this is probably something whoever's been building apps is convenient for you. We've got all the permutations, combinations over here, whether it's manual or whatever is the platform of choice for whatever development environment you're using. With that, I would like to hand it over to Priya to take you through the details of the API.
Thanks, Sachin, and hello, everyone. So, as Sachin briefly pointed out, right, Couchbase Lite 2.0, we've got a plethora of new features and enhancements. And over the course of next 25 minutes, I'm going to kind of give a whirlwind tour of these features in slightly more depth. And of course, there's only so much time, and I won't be able to do enough justice to each of these features, but Sachin and myself, we're going to be available throughout the day, so feel free to catch us, and if you're interested in any of these topics in more detail, we'll be happy to talk to you about that. So CRUD, one of the design principles behind the APIs was to make it very simple for developers to use. And you'll see instances of that throughout the examples that I'll be showcasing today. So creating and opening a database, it's actually a single line. All you have to do is say database and give a name of the database. There's an optional configuration parameter that you can send in. And this is if you want to override the default path where the database is located on your mobile app. This is what you would do. But otherwise, all you have to do is try database and then give the name of the database, and you have a JSON Couchbase Lite instance available for you. And of course, if you come from 1.4, you would see that's significantly different. Earlier, you had a manager and a factory class and so on. So all that stuff is gone. It's very simple. So CRUD operations, let's start with document creation, right? Creation of the document, you create an instance of a mutable document. You pass in two optional parameters. You can give an ID of the document. If you don't provide an ID of the document, one is created for you. And you can pass in a data parameter, which is essentially a map or a dictionary of named key value pairs. That constitutes your document. You can provide that as part of your initializer. But if you don't do that, you can use type setters for actually setting the various properties. So this actually introduces compile time checks. So you've got set string, set blobs, a blob date. These are not traditional JSON types, but we actually have a blob type for images, attachments, and so on. We have a data type, date type as well. You've got numeric types and so on. So it introduces compile time checks. It's, again, makes it easier for developers, introduces less errors. And save document, essentially saves the document. What do you do if you have to update the document? Updating a document, very similar to when you have to create a document. You fetch the document, give it the ID, fetch a document by ID. You get a mutable copy of that document. Use the same setters that I just spoke about to actually set or update the various values. You can introduce new properties or update existing properties. And of course, use the save document method to save the document. Deletion, very straightforward. Again, fetch the instance of the document that you want to delete and pass it as part of the delete document call. Now, something I want you to note over here is you're actually dealing with immutable instances of documents and data objects by default. So all the APIs in 2.0 are immutable, so which means they are thread safe by design. Again, this is another example of why one of the guiding principles behind the API design is to make it easier for developers, because you're quite likely going to be running in a multi-threaded environment. So trying to pass these objects around different threads, you're going to run into potential race conditions and other thread safety issues. So by making it immutable, we are enforcing that if you want to change any object, you're going to have to get a mutable instance of that object in the thread that you're operating on, and then all the changes are local to that thread, and you can save the object. So thread safety is another key tenet of the CRUD API or our API. Query and full-text search. So all our query APIs are fluent by design. So if you're not familiar with the fluent design pattern, it is an API design pattern that allows you to concatenate methods, so allows method chaining. So what it does, it lends itself to a domain-specific language. So it's very intuitive. So if you actually look at our APIs or our query APIs, you know exactly what it's doing. You don't need, it's self-documenting in a way. As Sachin pointed to, and as you saw in earlier sessions, we have SQLite semantics for querying our JSON documents. So you're familiar with NQL, probably familiar with NQL if you've been using Couchbase Server. Now we are bringing NQL-like semantics or a version of NQL into Couchbase Lite. And we have a query builder API, as you'll see very shortly, across all platforms. Of course, note that it's not a same API across all. I mean, it's idiomatic to the language that you're using. So if you're using Swift, it's going to feel idiomatic to Swift versus Java and so on. But the key is that the API is unified. So you know that if you're constructing an API a specific way in Java, it's going to be similar in Swift and or Objective-C, for instance. Here's an example of an API, a very simple query API in Java. So what it's doing is you have a select class. You're saying select. And the select result.all is basically requesting all the properties from all the documents that match the specific query. So select from your specific data source. And then you can have a where clause where you can have any logical combinations of your query expressions. So in this example, I have a logical combination. I'm saying, OK, this property type is equal to catalog, and size is equal to the specific value. You can have or, not, and so on. And of course, you can have order by. We do support pagination. There's a limit and offset, and so on. So as you can see, it maps very well to a corresponding SQL query, right? So it's very intuitive. If you come from a SQL world, this should be very familiar to you. Well, for whatever reason, we chose the two most verbose languages for our example. So there's Objective-C. Ignore all the square braces over here, but then it's essentially doing the same thing. But again, if you're an Objective-C developer, this should seem very familiar. It's doing the exact same thing as the previous one. We have what's called a query expression, which is used for defining what we do in as far as queries. So that was, I mean, like I said, each of these topics would be a talk by itself. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to cover all these other cases, but we actually have joins. We have array manipulation, so you can do array containment. You can enumerate or iterate over arrays. We have regex operations, pattern matching with light operators, functions, min, max, aggregations, math operations, and so on. So almost anything that you can imagine with SQLite, for instance, you can now do against JSON, but something more, right? You've got any array manipulation. You can do null property checks, something which doesn't exist in a SQL world. So FullText Search. Sachin already highlighted the benefits, right? Why you would want to bring in FullText Search to the edge. Mobile applications are becoming smarter, right? I mean, and mobile devices are getting more powerful, so it just makes more sense to bring some of that computation down to the edge to avoid the latency and the bandwidth, trying to get to the server all the time. So in order to do FullText Search is implemented using the match operator. So if you're familiar with SQLite, we're using the match operator for that. We support stemming. So for those who are not familiar with stemming, if I were to search for a word walk, it's going to look for other plural variants of the word walk. I can look for walks, walking, walked. It's going to match all of that stuff. We have tokeners, built-in tokeners for a lot of languages. You have to create a full text search index. I'll talk about index in a bit. And of course, and indexing is actually done eagerly as well. And of course, it's optimized for performance and low latency. So here is an example of a full text search of a full text search query, sorry. Note that in the slide deck over here, we are sort of alternating between different languages, but quite frankly, it doesn't matter what your programming background is, whether you're Java or a Swift or a C# developer. The goal over here is you look at this query, and with maybe the exception of Objective-C, it should seem very familiar what it is doing. Okay, so yeah, if it's like, hey, this is Java, no, this is Swift, it shouldn't matter. It should be intuitive. At least that's the goal. So the first thing is you have to create an index. I'll talk about how this index is created in a couple of slides. But for now, just bear in mind that we have a full text expression to which you provide an index, which is a full text index that you have to create. And I'll talk about how you do that in a second. But right now, we give a name to that index. And over here, we've just given a name which says that, OK, this is a full text index that is created on two properties, content and name. Just wait for a few seconds on how we create that. But for now, we have created that index. Once you do that, all you have to do for full text search is use the match expression. So in this example, what we are doing is looking for the word or term mechanical, any occurrences of the word mechanical in either the content or the name property. Okay? So this is all you have to do for full text search. So it's pretty straightforward. So indexing, right? Clearly, everyone knows the pros and cons of indexing. I mean, indexing, it's not required, except for full text searches. For regular queries, you don't have to create indexes. But clearly, depending on the complexity of the queries and your performance needs, you might want to create indexes. You've got to weigh it against the trade-offs of the space, right? There's going to be more space requirement if you're going to create too many indexes. And of course, there's going to be a little bit of impact on writes. But query reads are going to be very performant. So how do you create indexes? You can create value indexes. This is what you do. Use a database.createIndex, specify an index which you create using an index builder, the property on which you want to index, and then give a name. And you can use this, you can reference this index by this specific name later on. You can create indexes on any number of properties. So the second example, we are creating an index on both the type and the name property. So the full-text search index. So in the previous slide, when I talked about full-text search, I mentioned that you provide a full-text search index to a full-text search expression, right, a query expression. So this is how you create a full-text search index, very similar to a value index, except here you say it's a full-text index. You can give an array of items. In this case, it's going to be properties on which you want to index. So it can be a single array item, so over here, content. Or in the second case, you want to create an index on both content and name. Create the index and give it this name. So this is the index name that I referenced, if you recall the 2 slides back, when I referenced it in the full text search expression. So creating indexes is pretty straightforward. Now, eventing, we have different levels of granularity. Eventing essentially means asynchronously notifying your application of things that are happening or of important events that the application might be interested in related to the data. So you can do this at a database level. So anytime there is a change to the database, right, you have added a document, you've removed a document, updated a document, you notify the user. So you can add a change listener. Of course, for each of the add change listeners, there's going to be a corresponding remove change listener. So you can add change listener, give it a block or a function or an anonymous function where you specify, okay, what you want to do when you get a call back. Very similar, you can now actually have a change listener associated with a specific document. If there is a document of interest, say you're having an app, you have a view, and the contents of the view are populated based on a specific document. And you're interested anytime there is a change to that document, you want to be notified so you can update the UI, right? So you can do that by just adding a change listener to that document, so you get notified asynchronously anytime there is a change to the document, and you can update the UI. And of course, query. This is pretty powerful. So let's say I have a query where I am looking for, in this particular example, I'm searching for all documents where this property type is equal to this particular value. Now I can add a change listener associated with to this query. So essentially this makes it a live query. So this means anytime there is a change to the database that affects the results of that query, you're going to be notified. So note that even if you have a document and if there's a change to some other property in the document, you're not going to be notified. So you're going to be notified. So let's say you have a counter, right? And you have a counter and you want to update this counter on your UI anytime the counter value changes. Maybe the document has a whole bunch of other properties. You're not interested in changes to those properties. You can do that by actually associating a change listener and making it a live query. And of course, you can remove it at any point by removing the change listener. I think we have a Q&A at the end. Yes.
I'll hold the Q&A till the end. This way we can make sure we get everybody held. Thank you.
So on-device replicas. So if you attended the keynote earlier this morning, Scott alluded to one of the powerful capabilities that was introduced in 2.0 is data recovery on the edge. And Sachin pointed to some examples. So basically consider a field application, right? You are in the field. Let's say there's no network connectivity. You're in offline mode and you're collecting data in the field. And what if your app crashes, right? Or what if your device falls down? That happens, right? And what if you don't want to lose all the data? You have all these transactions, right? You made all these recordings and so on, and you don't want to lose them. So what we call this feature is data recovery on the edge. So it is essentially replication between 2 local databases. So you can in real time replicate between your main database associated with your app with another database. So you can have it on an SD card or something, and that's going to be a target database, and you can in real time replicate to that database. So which means even if your app crashes or something happens to your device, right, you still have a backup copy on the device that you can then recover from the device and transfer it to your sync gateway, to the Couchbase server, sync gateway, or whatever you want to do with it. So What you see here is actually an example of how you set up replication, and I have a couple of slides on replication alone, so it'll make a little more sense at that point. But over here, it should be quite self-explanatory what it's doing here. You specify a database endpoint. That's going to be your target of your replication. The replication configuration is where you specify the source and the destination for the replication. You say it's a push replication, right? You just want to, there's not going to be a two-way replication. It's just going to be a push. So you push from the main database to your backup, and then you start it, right? You say replicator.start. Oh, we've got like fancy animation here. Then, okay. So automatic conflict resolution. And Sachin mentioned it's probably one of the more controversial decisions that were made, but hopefully made the right one because it was based on a lot of data that we collected from folks using 1.4. So why do conflicts occur? I mean, it's inevitable in an environment where there are concurrent writers, correct? So let's say you have a Couchbase Lite database. You have loaded revision 1 of a document into memory, and you're editing it. So you've got a revision 2A in memory. But at the same time, while you're editing this in-memory copy of the document is actually getting replicated. So a new version is getting pulled from the server. So at a later point, when you try to save your in-memory version of the data into the database, you're going to get a conflict. Conflict can also happen during replication. Let's say you've got this set up with two devices which are syncing up with a sync gateway. All of them, it's in a utopian world, all of them have the same revision of the document. But we don't live in such a world. Let's say that one of the devices gets offline. And while it's offline, it's editing this document. Now the other device, the same document is being edited. It's online, so it's getting synced up to the cloud. Later on, when the offline device comes back online, it tries to push the document, you're going to have conflict. In 1.4, you had to deal with how you handle these conflicts. And in 2.0, this is what is done. So on local save, every time you actually try to save a document locally, this is the policy, last write always wins. You have the option of saying that if there is a conflict, fail on conflict, so notify me and I'll take care of what I have to do. Okay, so but there's never going to be a conflict resident in your database. So it's a conflict-free mode essentially. During replication, if you try to push up a document that results in a conflict, you're going to get a 409 conflict error back from the sync gateway. So what you do is during pull replication, you get the conflicting revision, and you apply a deterministic algorithm, which is basically deletes always win, or the longest revision tree wins. And you save the winning revision into the database. So we think that this should work for majority of use cases, but very happy to talk to anyone else who has a difference of opinion or has other use cases that are not satisfied with this policy. Replication 2.0, it's a WebSockets-based protocol, and so it's bidirectional, very efficient, right? I mean, you've got a single socket used for push and pull. This is what you would do for enabling sync. You saw a version of this when you did on-device replication. You specify the URL endpoint. So in the previous case, when you were doing on-device replication, you specify a database endpoint. So you say, okay, this is my endpoint, and of course, you can use WSS, which is the WebSockets secure version of WebSockets. And you can specify a whole bunch of configuration values. You can say you want push, push only, push and pull. Replication can be in continuous mode, which is real time. Changes are synchronized real time, or it can be one-off. It's a one-shot replication. You can specify the authentication parameters. Channels, right? I'm only interested in a subset of documents. You can do that by tagging your documents on the sync gateway using channel IDs, and then you are only interested in getting documents based on the channels. Then you create a replicator with that specific configuration. You can add a change listener. So anytime as the replication progresses, you can notify the user of the changes. So for example, busy, idle, stopped, connecting, and so on. And of course, you start the replication. Now, if this sounds, oh gosh, there's a lot of work, but really this is all you have to do. The rest of it is all default values, but I wanted to show what are those configuration parameters that are available to you so you can customize it to your needs. But this is all you have to do to enable sync. So yeah, that's all I had, and I'm going to turn it back to Sachin.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we're gonna, I'm seeing the Q&A sign from Art already. So we're just gonna go through these last couple of slides. Deployment options. So I think as we talked about this brand new API that's available with 2.0, it's important to know that that API is not compatible with the 1.x version of Couchbase Lite. So which means that if you've been using 1.x, you'll see that the API is different. When you upgrade to 2.0, you will see a bunch of compilation errors, and you would have to fix those compilation errors based on this new API. Hopefully we've given you a preview of how much simpler the 2.0 API is as opposed to 1.0. I know there's a few folks in the audience who've tried 2.0 and have given us great feedback. I've gotten a very, very similar feel from each of the early adopters who were a part of our initial beta program. In fact, one interesting data point is that once I shared the query API with one of our beta customers, they said that this is going to reduce our development time by around 50%, and asked why. Because they said we have one developer who's very familiar with MapReduce that builds our MapReduce views, and then there's another developer who takes that view and then builds the business logic in the app around it. So with this query API, we don't need the person building any complicated MapReduce views anymore. So there's a bunch of stuff that is a consequence of all the decisions that we've made in 2.0, and hopefully your experience with 2.0 would be consistent with what we've been hearing with the early adopters, which is that it's a lot simpler than 1.x and a lot more easier to learn and adopt as well. But that'll always give you that question. I cannot guarantee that all of my clients are going to upgrade to 2.0. So I will have clients that are on the older version of Couchbase Lite for as long as they wish to be. So I cannot force anybody to upgrade. So there's nothing to worry about from that perspective. The API might be compatible incompatible on the client side, but even if you have a 1.x client sitting out in the wild, they would be able to replicate with Sync Gateway, and any information going back to Sync Gateway would then be replicated back to a 2.0 client or whatever other clients you have. And the reverse is also possible. So you make an update from a 2.0 client, that update would be available to a 1.x client as well. So from a Sync Gateway perspective, we support both types of clients, and you have no timeline about in which you need to force your users to move to a certain version of your application. The last thing I'd like to talk about is what's coming down the pike. Very quickly in 2.1, so for Couchbase Lite, there's a bunch of API enhancement requests that keep on coming in, some things that we dropped in 1.x, so we will be looking at that and adding those. But in terms of big features, we're adding encryption back, so encryption didn't make it to 2.0 for a variety of reasons. And we're going to be bringing peer-to-peer back as well. I'd like to point out that both of these features would be a part of the Enterprise Edition only. So before 2.0 in 1.x, both of those were a part of the Community Edition and Enterprise Edition. But going forward, there's a bunch of work that's happened. We've re-architected both of these features, and they'll be a part of the EE Edition only. I don't want to be forgetting the gateway component. So there's a bunch of stuff that's happening on the gateway component as well. There was a lot that happened on 2.0. There's another session later today where we're going to be talking about 2.0 in general, or mobile in general. So you'll hear more about it there. But there's a bunch of improvements that are coming on the Sync Gateway side as well. So with that, I think this is all of the event hashtag and that stuff. We can talk about that later, but we're open for questions.
All right, we have a couple of questions. I say you had one from before, and then I've got one in the back as well.
Thank you. So I have a question related to that eventing. So you mentioned that if there is any change event, then you can just handle that change event. Does that mean that you don't need, if you're a, let's say, iOS developer, there is no need for the APNS notification. You just track this change and notify the user.
Yes.
Because we have a use case where we do make use of it today, where let's say there is a delay in the flight and we want to notify to the user, to the crew. Then what we do is through APNS we notify them that there is a delay alert. But if we get that delay alert document, say in CB Lite, and then we want to notify him, so we can just get rid of this APNS and other infrastructure, right? Other design part, right?
Yes, yes, you could. As you mentioned, if you have another way of getting that update to your local database, because this eventing
Yeah, I
is
mean,
local.
what I'm going to do is the alert I will have the affected crews, and I will create the channel for them, and they will always be subscribing to their channel, so they will get the alert document.
Yeah, yeah, and then in that case, yes, if you have a query associated or any of these other eventing, yes, you should be able to do that. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, the
And
short
I have
answer to that,
a
Gaurav, is
second
yes.
question before you move on. So you mentioned about the syncing mechanism where you have the WebSocket features, right? So do you have any documentation or anything where there are certain recommendations on the server side where you are maintaining the F5 URL load balancers, and then there any specific configuration needed there to make sure that the WebSocket connection with the server works?
Yeah, sure. Yes, it is there on a documentation portal, but quite frankly, it is just WebSocket based. So you just need to open the relevant ports and enable WebSockets. You know, if you whatever proxy you're using, if it is sitting behind a proxy, which I'm assuming your sync gateway is, you just have to configure that.
Okay.
But there's nothing special. We are not using any special protocol or something. It's just raw WebSockets.
Okay, because recently we faced some issue where we have to move from WebSocket to long pole. And then because with WebSocket we were getting bad request errors, and it was modifying the header somewhere in between. Okay. So that's where this F5 configuration I just asked just to be sure.
Okay, we can talk about that offline.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So one of the emerging ways doing an alternative mobile app is progressive web apps. So do you have any plans for Couchbase Lite for progressive web apps?
All right, that is a question that we get asked very often. We are in the process of evaluating demand for it. It's on our radar. It's not something that we are committing to just right now, but we are very seriously evaluating it, and I'm happy to have a conversation offline to learn more about your exact use case, and based on that, essentially build a business case for why we need something like that.
Okay. And one more do you support WPF apps for Couchbase Lite 2?
I'm sorry?
WPF apps?
WPF?
Like
Windows.
Windows, yeah.
Well, we have UWP. And
yeah. We have UWP support in Lite, so
that's
that
what we have. Yeah, we don't.
I don't think
That's all we have.
we've tested with WPF, if I remember correctly.
This one's closer.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more detail about the on-device replication? And it seems to me that the way you describe it, it seems like the developer actually has to make the decision of handling the on-device replication. And is there any plan, if that's the case, is there any plan to make it automatic so that the developer doesn't have to deal with it? It will be done automatically.
So when you say, I think, yeah, you're talking about the on-device replicas feature, which is a way for you to replicate whatever is there in your application to an external storage that then can be transported across devices. So as long as you have access to that external storage, like we showed here in the code, it's like 4 lines of code. So you, as a developer, would have to make the decision whether you need that or not, and basically go from there. So in many cases, it would make sense. I think we've had some customers who are talking about field service scenarios where, because of the criticality of the data, they cannot lose any data. So even if you're offline and the device stops working for a certain reason, that replica is available for you to move the SD card from one device to another. And I'm just using SD card as an example, and you could extrapolate that to your specific needs.
So really no plan to make it automatic?
Yeah, you have to call, you have to set it up. If you're asking, you have to do the replication, yes.
One more I think we have time for.
Yeah, I have a few small questions here. Yeah. So in the session before this one, they mentioned the new features in the in Nico, like ANSI join and a few unnest. Are these available on the mobile side?
We have joins very similar to ANSI joins. You'll see the syntax again. You know, as you can see, it's specific to a language. You know, you're going to get a query builder interface, but it's very similar to ANSI joins. You're going to have in syntax. We don't have unnest.
We don't have unnest right
feature.
now, and it's one of the things that we're evaluating on whether So again, we're working with our community to figure out what's the use case where you would need unnest and bring that in. An interesting input out there is that we had somebody come and tell us that they need indexing for all of the arrays that are stored within JSON objects as well. So again, it's a question of prioritizing, and we continue to get requests like that. But yes, I think from an overall language alignment perspective, we'd like to be as closely aligned as we can with the server version of NCL.
Okay.
But the way to think about it is NCL is a spec, it's a specification for accessing data, JSON data, and then there's one implementation on the server and there's another implementation on mobile. They're very closely aligned, but they may not be an exact match.
Okay. And also for the FullText search, is that a way to specify case sensitive or insensitive?
It is case insensitive, and you can you can. I think you can specify. Yes, you can. The pattern matching is sensitive, so you've got to do a lowercase. You convert everything. We have a function lower to lower function,
okay.
and then you can force that, so that way you match against the lowercase version. But yeah,
okay.
So yes, you can override that.
Also, sorry. So for the, I just noticed that for the query, for the query change event. How expensive is that? If I add a bunch of that, will that be very expensive on the mobile side? Like constantly running some query there?
We'd like to work with you to figure that one out.
We have been queuing for you.
The reason I say that is because, again, I think anytime we get asked a question like that, I'm very tempted to talk about some of the testing that we've done internally, but then that's not going to be representative of your exact use case over here. So which is why I think my response always is like, let's work with you to figure out what your needs are, and if you're like doing, let's say, query listener for 10 queries at the same time, if that's causing a battery drain, or is it causing other issues for you, we have one of the most engaged communities or development team on GitHub, so we're happy to work with you to figure out your specific use cases. And again, it's more an academic question in my view at this point, because once we get into application design, you might recognize that you might need it for like maybe 1 or 2 queries, not maybe 10 or 20 of them at the same time. So again, that's why I stay away from answering questions like that and say that we will work. So it's not like being translucent, it's being completely transparent, saying that it is very specific to your use case.
Thanks a lot. We will be available if there are questions after the session, but for the live streamers, and I know there's also lunch being served outside. I do want to thank you, Sachin, and as well, Priya, for an excellent presentation. And thank you for your participation. Hopefully we'll see you later on today.
All right.